Welcome to HeroesX office hours. My name is Gregory Nagy, and I'm being helped here by Claudia Philos, who has shown me the very interesting questions and concerns that have come up as a result of discussion question for hour one. And just to remind you, the question was, what does the story told by Agamemnon about Herakles, and you remember that is in Iliad 19, what does that story about Herakles tell us about the story told by the narrator of the Iliad about Achilles? Let me say it another way. And what does the micro-narrative, as told by Agamemnon to all assembled in Iliad 19, what does that micro-narrative tell us about the macro-narrative, which is the Iliad in its entirety? And I just described a minute ago that macro-narrative as the story told by the narrator of the Iliad. Let's call him Homer. And there were some very interesting answers or comments, and I think I want to start with what Steve Tompkinson wrote, and then I'll continue by commenting on various thoughts that some of you had in reaction to Steve's paragraph. So Steve writes, the first thing that comes to mind is the importance of fate or destiny in deciding the course of their lives. And by their lives, Steve obviously means the lives of the people inside the story told by Agamemnon, which would be a story about Herakles. And then in the outer frame, that is to say in the Iliad itself, the story of Achilles himself. And if I understand you, Steve, what you're really saying is that the same way that Herakles is involved with fate or destiny, that same way applies to the way Achilles is involved with fate or destiny. And to push your summary even further, you would be saying then that the fate of Herakles is comparable to the fate of Achilles. Before I comment on this formulation about the fate or destiny of Herakles in the micro-narrative and the fate or destiny of Achilles in the macro-narrative, let me talk about some of the reactions to Steve's formulation. Here's one posted by L. Gibbs. I can't wrap my head around fate versus choice. That their fate, this is the fate of Herakles, the fate of Achilles, that their fate was preordained is set out, but the narrative suggests some choice still. Achilles chooses a path that is consistent with his fate, but was it really a choice? Some people simply have a higher calling that compels them forward. Well, I appreciate these concerns about fate and destiny as they seem to shape the choices that heroes make. But I worry a little bit about even the word fate and the word destiny. I can think of Greek words that I would translate that way, such as Isa, A-I-S-A, or Moira, M-O-I-R-A. But you know, they're not the words that are being used here in Agamemnon's speech that tells about the story of Herakles. And if anything, what he's simply saying is that a goddess whose name is Ate, which means an aberration, an event that has gone wrong, that Ate made him do something, made him choose something. I don't really see any direct involvement of a goddess called Fate, for example, here. And I see lots of choices being made. And sure, you can say that in the fullness of time, whatever happens in a traditional story is fated to happen, but it's not so much that fate is making people do things, it's that the story has a predictable outcome. And that means there's still a lot of choices that are being made by people. And some of the commentators actually use not just the word choice that we have seen from L. Gibbs, but if I can go ahead here a little bit, Mick Duncan, and then a reaction to Mick from Speranza #1. And Mick will take us in a different direction. He says, unlike today's leaders, there's an assumption by Agamemnon that rulers are fallible. Even Zeus, if not exactly fallible, then at least not immune to malevolent outside influences. And with this admission is the ability to apologize and make amends, as he does at the end. Well, Mick, I'm not sure that he apologizes in the sense that he owns up to a bad mistake he made personally. Isn't he saying, it's not my fault, it was Ate, this personification of the goddess that makes things go bad. It was Ate who made me do it. Speranza follows up. Agamemnon uses the tale of Herakles to deny responsibility and blame. And what Speranza also says that when it comes to blame, that Agamemnon blames Ate while also comparing his situation and perhaps implicitly himself with Zeus. I think that's making things more subtle. I like the direction in which Speranza 1 is going, but I still have to tie things together, maybe in a slightly different way. I worry in general whenever we try to explain something as complicated as this. In terms of what we see experienced by leaders today, sometimes it's good to think with what leaders today will do, but we also have the responsibility of figuring out what the system of storytelling in the Iliad is actually working towards, which may be different from any of the analogies that we pick up, at least on the surface. And, you know, a German professor would say, this is a case of double determination, where yes, somebody makes a choice of his or her own free will, but this choice is part of the story. So in a sense, is it really a choice? And then you come up with words like destiny or whatever. But in this story, it's the arbitrariness of everything that seems to be emphasized. What made him do it? It doesn't add up. And Ate is simply, I think, a better way to think about what's going on and what went wrong both for Herakles and what went wrong for Achilles. And in the case of Herakles, whatever went wrong meant that he would have to be subordinate to somebody who is not as good a hero as he is. And certainly that's also the case with Achilles. Achilles, because he happens to be lower ranking in Achaean society than Agamemnon, finds himself in a position where he is subordinated to the commands of Agamemnon, and he doesn't like it, just as Herakles didn't like it, but that's the way things were in their respective social situations. That to me is a very powerful parallel. And then the fact that it's Agamemnon who's telling the story kind of undercuts the position of Agamemnon. Maybe he doesn't understand what's going on. After all, what the two stories are telling us is that Agamemnon is inferior to Achilles. And we certainly know that by the time we reach Iliad 19, don't we? So I would have preferred a different kind of answer. I'm not criticizing the wonderful attempts that have been made, but in a sense, I think you're making things too hard for yourselves. And if you just look at the logic of the story, both the micronarrative about Herakles and the macronarrative about Achilles, you'll see that they're very obvious parallelisms involving inferior people who are giving commands to superior people. And that's not destiny per se, that just happens to happen in these two situations. And that's what Agamemnon is talking about when he tells the story of Herakles, not realizing that that story, in its simple logic, undercuts his own position as leader, because he may be the leader, but he's inferior to Achilles. Before we leave this subject, may I talk a little bit about the comment by Kempi? I hope I'm pronouncing your pseudonym correctly, K-E-N-P-P-Y. I struggled with it, but I like the sound of Kempi. And Kempi writes, I can see the parallelism between the two stories as expressed in several replies above. But I'm not sure that Agamemnon's apology is genuine. Well, thank you, Kempi. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because if he says, all right, I'm sorry, but it wasn't my fault. Ate, the goddess of things going badly, made me do it. That's not really owning what he did that was so repellent to Achilles, and really repellent to all the Achaeans once they figured things out, and repellent to everybody who listens to the story of the Iliad. It's something that is very insincere or dishonest, and I'm not being subjective here. He is made to look insincere and dishonest, I think, by the macro narrative and by how he tells the story. While we're on the subject of telling a story, please keep in mind, everybody, and now I'm thinking about all the various responses we've had to date. We're dealing with a traditional medium. That means that not only is it handed down from generation to generation, but people don't like to see stories monkeyed with when they're traditional stories. They have expectations. In literary criticism, we call this horizons of expectation. So there are things that you can and cannot say in stories. And it's better to think of it that way, tradition, rather than to think, oh, fate made him do it, or some goddess who is responsible for things going bad made him do it. Tradition. Tradition is everything in this medium, and tradition is not something that holds people back. It makes people communicate with each other because they know what the guidelines are, and they know how characters figure in the stories for which they are characters. The plot and the characters go together. And not only does the plot go with the characters, but the form in which the plot is articulated. And I could get technical with you by talking about dactylic hexameter, which is the rhythm, the traditional rhythm, inside which the story is told. But let me not be technical and talk about the rhythm or the meter, in other words, the formal container, but talk about how this meter affects meaning. And sometimes people have a way of over-interpreting the work of Milman Parry when Milman Parry talks about the strict correlation of meter and phraseology, wording, rhythm and wording. And if you like, instead of saying phraseology or wording, you can use Milman Parry's term, formula. And just to remind you, Milman Parry was that pioneer in the study of the formalism, the wording of Homeric poetry. And remember, he was the teacher of Albert Lord, and I'm happy to say Albert Lord was my teacher, so Milman Parry doesn't go all the way that far back. Parry's teaching about formula and meter shows that you can't just say something like, oh, the meter made the poet do something. So for example, there's an epithet like rosy-fingered dawn. Well, some people will say you had to have a word that fits the rhythm, in other words, fits the meter, and that happens to fit, and we can give it a name, like a generic word. In this case, since it's describing dawn, the sunrise, who is a female divinity, when you're describing the dawn goddess as rosy-fingered, it's not only that a certain word happens to fit metrically, and so you have to use it in thinking of the dawn. You must remember that this medium, which is a traditional medium, has to involve form and content together. Form and content interact, and this interaction happens through time. So it's not just once, it's yet another time and another time, because we're dealing with a medium where performance and composition are aspects of the same process, and where every time something is re-performed, it's recomposed at the same time. And so there's a very strict relationship between form and content, between a formula like rosy-fingered and the content, which is the breaking of dawn. And that relationship cannot be misinterpreted as a situation where I just have to say rosy-fingered because the meter, the rhythm makes me say it. They just develop together from the get-go. And I'll tell you something else. What's beautiful about formula and meter, in the case of an epithet like rosy-fingered, and then da-da-dum-da-da, the rhythm into which that fits and which describes as a package the sunrise, as if she were a goddess. What's beautiful about all of this is that any individual who hears this phrase at any given performance either has heard it before or will hear it again. If you're somebody my age back then, you would have heard it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. If you were a kid who just heard it for the first time, you're destined to hear it many times over. And each time you hear it, it's really a different experience because your life keeps changing. And that means that the richness of this expression, rosy-fingered dawn, is something that lives with you. And let's go back to that example of the rhythm, da-da-dum-da-da, which is rhododactylos, which is rosy-fingered. This epithet that describes in a predictable way the goddess of sunrise. To repeat my point, and it bears repeating, it's beautiful the way an audience in the ancient song culture would hear this not once but many times. It becomes a personal experience because you're living through life at the particular time you hear it, and then the next time you hear it, your life is different and it all interweaves. So it's a very personal thing, it's not just a mechanical thing. And to add to the excitement, I remember the great literary critic Hugh Kenner telling me once that, this is just a theory, but I like it, that the real meaning of rhododactylos is not rosy-fingered, but rosy-toed, because in ancient Greek, dactylos is both the digits of the hand and the digits of the foot. Well, if that's true, there's a good reason for the dawn to be called rosy-toed, because in that famous sunrise scene when Odysseus comes back from Hades and the sun rises as he nears the island of Circe, the dawn goddess is described as rising from the horizon where she dances. So the horizon in the east is the dancing place of the dawn goddess. Well, that would make it a pretty good bet that rhododactylos means rosy-toed, not rosy-fingered. And if Hugh Kenner is right, Milton, the great Milton, understood this, and his poetry reflects the idea that the dawn goddess is rosy-toed, not just rosy-fingered. But anyway, these images are so beautiful, and they're obviously images to live with, and they're conveyed by tradition. And there's nothing wrong with tradition. I know that we moderns tend to think of tradition as something that holds us back, that stops us from being creative. But for the ancient world, especially in ancient Greek song culture, it was something that enhanced personal feelings and personal creativity. May I stop here and ask myself, what do I mean when I say song culture? I simply mean that there are societies that have singing and dancing and the various other forms of verbal art that are related to singing and dancing. And in some of these cultures, it's part of everyday life and also special moments in life, but it's not just something that is done in a kind of separation from your life. It's part of your life. And especially in societies where ritual, and by ritual I mean any kind of formalized behavior where you follow certain patterns of existence because not only you're doing it, but your ancestors have done it, and as far as you know, everybody's done it before you. That kind of way of life where singing and dancing becomes part of that way of life, then I just go and call it song culture. We're talking about societies where everybody has a part in all the major songs, not just selectively as we do, where one person may say, well, I was really affected by Crimson and Clover, a song from the 60s, or I really like Love Potion Number 9, which is a silly song, but when people heard it, they loved it. No, this is something where the whole society grows up with certain kinds of song, like the Homeric Iliad and the Homeric Odyssey in 5th century Athens, just for one example, but I can multiply that example 100 times. That's what I mean by song culture. I better say something about song and dance. I'm not just saying it from a modern point of view. I'm thinking of, for example, the ancient Greek word choros, K-H-O-R-O-S, borrowed into Latin as C-H-O-R-U-S, borrowed into English as chorus. And so we think, oh, chorus is a group of singers. Well, in ancient Greek, it's a group of singers and dancers. And singing and dancing were organically connected. It gets better. Singing, when it's taken away from dancing, divorced from dancing, can become specialized as reduced singing or non-singing. You and I call it poetry, but they consider poetry simply to be an extension of singing. So in ancient Greek, singing and dancing are formally connected to poetry. And when I say song culture, I mean dancing, singing, poetry, instrumental accompaniment, everything, because they're all organically connected, even though sometimes they can make their appearance separately from each other. For us, it's a permanent separation.